The game I'm reviewing today is technically called MechWarrior 3050, but also Battletech 3050 in Japan. Its Genesis or Mega Drive release is simply called Battletech as well. These three games are all technically the same, just with three variations on the title. However, none of them are to be confused with the other Super Nintendo game called MechWarrior. That game's an updated version of the original MS-DOS MechWarrior with a few extra bells and whistles, but it's also confusingly called Battletech on the Super Famicom in Japan. 3050 is a sequel to that one though, and wildly simpler in gameplay. And yes, I am aware that even if it's MechWarrior, the game takes place in the Battletech universe. Nonetheless, it's still pretty confusing, especially if people had multiple systems back in the day, and these games look wildly different with their covers. With this review, I'm going to be going through all three versions of the game and see exactly what the differences are, and maybe shed some light on why it became forgotten and wasn't actually considered a sequel after MechWarrior 2 came out. I know there's some people out there that might oppose that statement, however this game is considered a sequel to the original MechWarrior, and therefore it's a little confusing why they moved on to MechWarrior 2 instead of keeping this the technical MechWarrior 2. And what's even more confusing is that they use the exact same cover image for both MechWarrior 3050 and MechWarrior 2. I'd love to hear all your thoughts on why this might be, so if you have any, feel free to put them in the comments section below, and let's get to the review. It was a hard choice between playing the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis version first. I love both systems equally, though I have grown a bit of a bias towards Sega systems, since they tend to be where the more experimental games live. So I only thought it was right that I show the odd child out some love. Though if I was considering the Super Nintendo a child of mine, then that would make MechWarrior 3050 the try-hard grandchild who really wants to impress Grandpa, but doesn't quite have the skill set or emotional maturity to make the impact they want. Oh, and yeah, I'm perfectly aware that Battletech on the Sega Genesis is the original version of these games, but it doesn't hurt to mix things up though in my books. I really don't cover enough Super Nintendo games here. Firing up the cartridge, you're presented with a pretty decent cutscene that basically shows the infamous Timberwolf, or Mad Cat if you will, firing at some enemies. It isn't even close to the best introduction I've seen on a Super Nintendo game, but it's always nice to see something like these opening cutscenes. When I was a kid, they really got my head into the world of whatever game I was playing. Every stage begins with a briefing, and you absolutely cannot skip these in later missions. The exact way you're supposed to progress a mission, down to what the target looks like, is included here. Sometimes these briefings can be extremely vague, and you're left without any idea where a target is, usually because the game wants you to actively look for it. After the briefing, you're able to choose a simple loadout to take into battle. All of these weapons are okay, but none of them really have the power or punch someone would want when piloting one of the best designed mechs ever. Seriously, that Timberwolf Mad Cat design still hits all the right marks for me. If MechWarrior 3050 gets anything right, it's that player sprite. It is done so well. The very first stage is where you're going to learn what most of this game is about. There are some environmental variations, which I'll be getting into later, but they only add annoyance, if anything. From the get-go, everything is in chaos. Grunts and mechs are shooting wildly everywhere at all times. It never actually seems like the AI knows how to operate itself, unable to cope with the limited isometric view. There are buildings everywhere, and if you've read the briefing, it's clear what all the buildings do, but you still might find yourself a little confused because even then, at times things can be very vague. Visually, you're going to notice something is up with all the enemies in this game. Primarily, they have a black outline that your mech does not. No rival mechs are the same size as you either. For some reason, their sprites are generally much smaller. I don't know if the intention was to give players a feeling of power as they plot across the landscape, but it just doesn't work visually. The AI also doesn't know how to handle most of the larger mech's animations and flails around wildly, firing in circles as it tries to hit you. There are some detailed death and failure animations though, which surprised me a bit. You know, I just wanted to throw one positive out there.
Mission failed.
Adding to the chaos is the incredible slowdown that can happen at any given time. Sometimes I thought it was the amount of sprites, and others I thought it was due to the maps being so big. Your mech will suddenly move extremely smoothly out of the blue, only to become sluggish and slow as the frame rate wobbles out of control. I don't know much about the Super Nintendo hardware. There are so many people out there on YouTube that can provide a way better rundown than me, but I know plenty of other games with larger maps and enemy counts that don't even come close to performing like 3050 does. There is no music either, only during briefings. The only sounds that will be accompanying your missions are the thumping footsteps of the Timberwolf, paired with the endless firing sounds of enemies. It's a shame too, because music might have made the feel of 3050 a little better. Instead, it just adds to the tedium. There are a few voice clips here and there too when selecting weapon loadouts, but it isn't anything to write home about.
Rifle, PPC, Gauss rifle, machine gun, laser, machine gun, auto cannon.
There were already games that did this long before the Super Nintendo, and they were way more impressive because they were on far more limited hardware.
I know what you're thinking, punk. You're thinking that he fired 6 shots or only 5. Now, to tell you the truth, I forgot myself in all this excitement. But being this is a 44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, and will blow your head clean off, you could ask yourself a question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
Though you have a big environment to walk around in, 3050 doesn't want you to go about completing things your way. Instead, everything has to be done as the briefing said. No mercenary work here, no creativity. You're completing a mission as you were ordered, and that's it. If the game does anything clever, it's that it finds new and progressively annoying ways to make sure you stick to the structure it demands. Sure, sometimes you can destroy a few buildings early, but you won't be destroying that big, obvious fortress or its defenses until 3050 absolutely wants you to. Though I still wouldn't be surprised if there was somebody out there that speedran this whole game in like 3 minutes, even though I find that completely impossible. Controls are about what you'd expect from a tilted isometric game on the Super Nintendo. I can't exactly rip into this game for having the same flaws as its contemporaries, yet the game is still incredibly off in a way that can only be experienced by literally playing it. There is a stiffness in its controls and a wild lack of accuracy in its firing. A few weapons have an auto-aim that compensates for this just a little bit, but it makes actually moving around feel very off. Automatically changing the direction of the Timberwolf's upper body does a lot more to throw off movement than it should, though I do kind of get what the developers were going for here. And you can manually pivot as well, which is kind of cool.
Mission complete.
After completing the first mission, you're promoted and given a level password. It seems like the mass genocide of foreign forces really does pay off after all. Sadly, the game immediately hits you with a timed mission that forces you to learn about the game's more vague concepts, primarily the radar. Here you're tasked with finding 2 pyramids to the south and northeast. However, the game does not tell you that. There is no hint that you're supposed to pause the game and use the radar to find your target. Instead, you'll probably do what I did and play the same stage for 40 minutes. Even when I use the radar, these pyramids are not immediately visible. Mission 2's map is so huge that the radar screen can't cover it, so you have to move around and constantly check the pause menu to see if you are close. Now, this wouldn't be too much of an issue, but this objective is timed, and even if you know exactly where these pyramids are, you have to be razor focused with your trek there, making sure to not spend too much time on enemies that want you dead pretty badly. After making you rely on the radar, finally learning that it even exists, 3050 proceeds to slap you in the face by making the next mission begin with the radar disabled. You have to now aimlessly explore a frozen wasteland in hopes of taking out radar jammers. And even if you manage to have one continue left by this point, you deserve so much better. Why are you playing this? Because it looks cool? Just please don't do this to yourself. We care. Well, I care. Subscribe and like, or like and subscribe. Whichever way you want to do it, I appreciate it. Oh, and I thought I'd also throw in that this game doesn't have a marker for continues. It doesn't tell you at any point that you have them or how many you might have left. You just eventually run out, but I found out as I was playing that it's around 3. You have 3 lives through this entire game. Due to the environmental factors, you have to discover how these affect your mech by simple trial and error. Cracks in fire affect your Timberwolf's cooling level, Oh, yeah, that's right. There isn't health in this game. You have a heat meter that results in destruction when it reaches maximum. Ice causes you to slip around everywhere, and the oh-so-kind developers have been nice enough to add spikes nearly everywhere it is present. What's worse about this release specifically is that it came after the Genesis version. A lot of stuff could have been improved, like the absolutely broken enemy movement, or how unfair objectives end up being. Yet, it wasn't. I'm not sure if that would be called integrity or foolishness. It could also be that Tiberian Entertainment was more concerned with porting it than actually making any changes as well. Since they didn't actually develop the Genesis version, I really don't know. I can only really say what the game actually is. And honestly, that's just that it's a stiff mess. Not a lot changed between either version of the game, aside from a few small things. The biggest, really, is the title and cover art. I like both, but I really like the Battletech version. It's got that gritty sci-fi novel look. It also claims that the game has 16 megabytes of power, but I'll be honest, I don't even know what that means. A lot of Genesis games like to throw technical jargon into their advertising, even if it didn't make sense. In this case, I'm really not sure what they're talking about. The Genesis had 64 kilobytes of RAM, and the average cart only held 4 megabytes, with the biggest being 8 megabytes. So if I'm missing something here, feel free to tell me in the comments below, because I'm utterly confused. Well, I'm honestly always confused. Being the original version and a Sega game, the graphics are a little bit different. Things look a little washed out in comparison to its Super Nintendo counterpart, but the colors are a little bit stronger as well. It's almost like there's just a little less definition in the sprites. There is also either a slightly closer camera angle, or else the building sprites are a bit bigger. Honestly, nothing to write home about. There is a lock-on that occurs when firing though, and so long as your mech is shooting, it'll stay moving in whatever direction it was facing. Not only does this make the game even more frustrating, it also happens to make it incredibly confusing. There were more than enough buttons on the Sega controller to allow the same pivot controls as the Super Nintendo version, but you know, maybe it wasn't thought of until the game was ported over, so I can't really fault anyone here. The game's sounds are the biggest difference here, with a lot more voice clips present for picking up items.
Gauss rifle.
Of course, there was a total different sound card, so the menu music is a little different too. It really comes down to preference here. Personally though, I enjoy the unique sound of either card. It all depends. Though as you probably guessed, it really doesn't make any sort of difference, and no, there isn't any level music here either, so it's all negligible. As an added bonus, I thought it might be fun to throw in the Japanese version of these games too. Again, there isn't much in terms of gameplay differences or anything, even the voice clips remain in English. You see, the enemy mechs in this version have been completely replaced with Toho-style kaiju robots. Not only that, they're a tad slower and easier to deal with too. Why this is, I have no idea. I couldn't tell you. It is clear that they've been pasted from somewhere else though, as their colors and art style are completely different from both the player and enemy sprites. Maybe it was thought that the concepts behind MechWarrior wouldn't sit right with Japanese audiences, so why not throw in the most stereotypical Japanese thing ever? Man, times have changed. Well, it isn't hard to know what I think about this one, or these three ones I guess. Whatever you play, and no matter what you call it, 3050 is a difficult mess. Don't get me wrong, it looks cool and features one of my personal favorite mech designs, but that doesn't mean anything when a game plays like this. There is a 2-player mode, but I didn't have anyone on hand to torment this time around. From what I can gather, it involves both players controlling the same Timberwolf, and this game certainly has enough things going against it. Now, neither this game or the original really have a lot of staying power. You don't hear about them anymore. You still hear about MechWarrior 2 because that game is legendary, but this is technically MechWarrior 2 before MechWarrior 2, but also not because it's just a rebranded version of Battletech on Sega Genesis, so it's both games. It's confusing. My thoughts on the matter are that they just didn't know where to go, and they never really planned a sequel to MechWarrior. That's probably why it was called Battletech on the Genesis, because MechWarrior was just a game in the Battletech universe. When they brought it over to the Super Nintendo, it's likely that they just wanted to start a franchise, and that's where the idea sort of seeded. So while this game is pretty bad, I'd like to throw a guess out there and say that it probably is where the idea for a further MechWarrior franchise started. But that's just a theory. Mech theory?